Reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Then they came to Capernaum, and on the Sabbath Jesus entered the synagogue and taught. The people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. In their synagogue was a man with an unclean spirit. He cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Jesus rebuked him and said, "Quiet, come out of him." The unclean spirit convulsed him, and with a loud cry came out of him. All were amazed and asked one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." His fame spread everywhere, throughout the whole region of Galilee. The Gospel of the Lord. So I was trying to recall examples from my own childhood where I made some outlandish claim and someone told me to prove it. You know, I can't remember the exact examples, but I know that it happened. And I was talking to one of our students recently, and I asked him for an example of this, and he said, "Well, I was number one in the country in my sport." And my friend said, "Oh yeah, well, prove it." You know? For me, it was probably like, you know, one of those stupid things like, "My dad's stronger than your dad." You know, it's like I was going to be a young Don King or something, trying to set up, a fight between my dad and somebody else's. I don't know. But, you know, I thought about that because, you know, at the beginning of Moses' call to lead the people, the Israelites, out of the slavery to Pharaoh and into the promised land, he has a situation of prove it. You know, and God calls him to go to the Israelites and say, "Hey, God has seen your plight and he wants to get you out of here. I've talked to him." And he's expecting them to say, "Prove it." So God says, "Okay, Moses, you got that staff in your hand, throw it down on the ground." And he does, and it turns into a snake. And he freaks out because his staff just turned into a snake. And God says, "Okay, pick it up by the tail, it's fine," and it turns back into the staff. He says, "If they still don't believe you after you do that, take your hand and press it to your chest. Okay, now pull it away." And his arm became leprous. He had leprosy on his arm. And he freaked out again. He said, He said, "Okay, put it back on your chest and take it back," and it was normal again. And he says, "If those two things aren't enough for the people, then take some water out of the river, bring it up on dry land, and it's going to turn into blood." Okay, pretty significant signs. But here's the thing. God calls Moses to do this great thing in the life of Israel, and he doesn't leave him out there stranded to just convince the people. He gives him these signs and wonders to prove God's power and authority in him. And what happens? Well, they're led out of Egypt, and they go through the Red Sea, and eventually they get to the Promised Land. In our reading today from the book of Deuteronomy, we're reminded that Moses told the people, I'm going to die and pass on, but God's going to raise up another prophet like me. So they had this expectation from the time of Moses that there was going to be another prophet like him who would lead the people of Israel. So what does God do at the beginning of Jesus' ministry to prove that he has the authority as that prophet who was to come, but he gives him signs and wonders to work in the midst of the people? And that's where we pick up in Mark's Gospel today. The first thing that Jesus is doing to prove to the people that he is the one that they are called to follow is to cast out this demon. He's showing that he has power over the spiritual realities of the world. Later on, actually right after this passage, he'll end up curing illnesses and showing that he has power over the natural world as well. And a couple chapters later, he'll calm the storm on the sea and showing people that he has power over the spiritual realm, the natural realm, and revealing himself to be God. So God gives him these signs and wonders to prove it to the people. And he does in this wondrous way. I mean, this guy who was possessed by a demon was clearly set apart in a way that no one would appreciate being. right? And Jesus casts out the demon from him, and he is changed. I was thinking a lot today about, actually, it came up last night. I was talking to somebody who, they were struggling with doubts about their faith because they would have people come to them at school and people would challenge them on matters of faith. And they didn't have ways to prove it to them. And it reminded me, even in my own experience of conversion, I remember thinking very clearly that there's not a whole lot that I can prove to people about my faith. I don't know, the whole width and depth of everything that there is to know. So I can't necessarily logically explain this all to people. But I always said from the beginning of that time when I truly encountered the Lord that my greatest proof that God exists is what He's done in my own life, how He's changed me. And that's so true really for all of us. I mean, what convinces people of God's power and authority in our lives is the power of witness of my life having been changed by Him. And I think that's important for us to know today because, as we place ourselves in the place of that man in the synagogue whom Jesus cast the spirit out of, isn't there a place in each of us that recoils at the thought of Jesus making us clean again? Maybe we're not completely possessed by a demon, but, as we, act in this behavior versus that one, as we know that God calls us to this particular way of life, but we're over here, as we're aware of what He asks us and calls us to do, but we resist, we hear a voice inside us saying, "What have you to do with us? Have you come to destroy us?" And that's not the voice of the part of us who has allowed God to change us, who has allowed the identity of being a beloved son or daughter of the Father to really take root in us. That's the voice of that unclean spirit who wants to not be alone, away from you, who doesn't want to be cast out from you. There's at least a corner of our hearts that resists God's power and action in us. But He promises that He can cast out whatever it is, the behavior, thought, action, whatever part of us that resists His complete and total love, He can cast out. Certainly with some cooperation on our parts as we grow in virtue. But there's a real change that takes place when we offer our entire body, mind, spirit to Him to cast out all spirits that go against Him. We're transformed, and we know the reality of His power and authority. We know the freedom of His love, and we have proof of His existence in us and in the world. As we hear this passage from the Gospel of Mark today, I think it's just a good opportunity for us to allow Him to come to us today in this church, not a synagogue, but in this church, and recognize that we have things in us that aren't perfect, that aren't clean, that maybe we're resistant to giving up and over to Him. And just take the opportunity to say, "Lord Jesus, I give you all corners of my life. Let you cast it out from me so I can have the freedom to live as the beloved sons and daughters that we are. To not hold back, to trust that He hasn't come to destroy us, but He's come to give us life so that we might experience that in complete and total freedom."